You're exhausted in a way you've never felt before. It's not just physical tiredness. You could have slept 8 hours and still wake up feeling like you ran a marathon. It's not just mental fatigue, though your head feels heavy too, like you're processing too much information all the time. It's a tiredness that goes to your bones, a weariness of the soul. You look at your to-do list and feel like you're staring at Mount Everest. Things that used to be automatic, answering messages, grocery shopping, calling friends, now feel like impossible mountains to climb. And the most confusing part is that, theoretically, your life should be lighter now. You're more aware, more awake. You understand how things work better. You should feel more energized, not completely drained. But it's like every time you take a step toward consciousness, a part of you has to die. And dying, even when it's necessary, is exhausting. Maybe you've started questioning things you always accepted without thinking. Your job, your relationships, your beliefs about what's important in life, and discovering that much of what you've built might be based on illusions is draining. Or maybe you're seeing patterns in your life you never noticed before. Repetitive behaviors, vicious cycles, unconscious ways of sabotaging yourself. And seeing all this clearly is like turning on a light in a messy room. Suddenly, you have a lot of work ahead of you. You might find yourself sleeping more, but feeling less rested, or lying awake at night with your mind spinning through realizations you wish you could unknow. Simple decisions that used to be easy now feel overwhelming because you can see all the layers of complexity beneath them. Your friends might not understand why you seem so tired all the time. You're becoming more spiritual, they say. Isn't that supposed to make you happy? But they don't realize that awakening isn't like taking a vitamin that gives you instant energy. It's more like renovating a house while you're still living in it. Carl Jung understood this exhaustion intimately. He knew that consciousness doesn't come free. Every piece of awareness you gain, every illusion you see through, every pattern you break, it all requires tremendous psychic energy. And most people have no idea how much energy they've been spending keeping themselves unconscious. Think about it this way. Imagine you've been living in a house where you only used the ground floor, and you kept the upstairs locked and ignored. It was simpler that way. Less to think about, less to maintain, less to deal with. But one day, you decide to unlock that upstairs door. What you find up there is decades of accumulated stuff. Old memories you buried, emotions you never processed, dreams you abandoned, parts of yourself you rejected. Some of it is treasure, some of it is trash. All of it needs to be sorted through. That sorting process, that's what's making you so tired. Jung called this the confrontation with the unconscious. He knew that becoming conscious isn't a gentle, gradual process like learning to play piano. It's more like archaeological excavation. You're digging up layers of your psyche that have been buried for years, sometimes decades. And just like real excavation, it's dirty work. It's physically demanding. It requires tools you might not have used before. And you can't just dig randomly. You have to be careful, methodical, respectful of what you're uncovering. Let me tell you about Marcus. He was a 34-year-old architect who started having what he called reality shifts after his father died. Suddenly, the career he'd built, the apartment he was proud of, the relationship he thought was solid, everything felt like it was made of cardboard. At first, he thought it was just grief, but months passed, and instead of the clarity getting easier, it got more intense. He could see how much of his life had been built around getting his father's approval. How many of his choices weren't really his choices. How much energy he'd been spending maintaining an image that wasn't even really him. The insight was liberating, but the aftermath was devastating. Marcus found himself exhausted by the simplest interactions. Conversations with colleagues felt like wearing a mask that got heavier by the hour. Dating became impossible because he could see all the games people played, including his own games. Even choosing what to eat for breakfast became overwhelming because he was suddenly aware of all the unconscious patterns that used to make the choice automatic. I feel like I'm learning to be human all over again, but this time I'm doing it consciously, and it's exhausting. Jung would have recognized Marcus's experience immediately. He called it the provisional life coming to an end, that phase where you live according to other people's expectations and society's scripts because it's easier than figuring out who you really are and what you really want. But when the provisional life starts crumbling, you're left with a massive reconstruction project. You have to rebuild your identity, your relationships, your daily routines, your long-term goals, everything from a completely new foundation. And construction work, whether it's on a house or a psyche, is exhausting. The tricky part is that this kind of exhaustion often gets misunderstood, both by you and by the people around you. It looks like depression, but it's not depression. It looks like laziness, but it's not laziness. It looks like you're giving up on life, but actually, you're working harder on life than you ever have before, just not in ways that are visible to the outside world. Jung understood that this kind of spiritual exhaustion is actually a sign that something profound is happening. He called it the sacrifice of the ego. Not the destruction of the ego, but the ego learning to serve something larger than itself, instead of being the king of your inner castle. Think of your ego like a CEO who's been running a company based on outdated business models. For years, everything seemed fine. The company was profitable, employees showed up, customers were satisfied. But then the market changed, technology evolved, and suddenly the old ways of doing business don't work anymore. Now the CEO has two choices: resist the change and eventually go bankrupt, or completely restructure the company. The restructuring option is the right choice, but it's exhausting. Every system has to be examined. Every process has to be questioned. Every employee has to be retrained or replaced. The CEO has to learn entirely new skills. That's what your psyche is going through right now. Your ego is learning to operate in a completely new reality, one where consciousness matters more than comfort, where authenticity matters more than approval, where truth matters more than convenience. And just like any major restructuring, it requires enormous amounts of energy, especially in the beginning when nothing is automatic yet and every decision requires conscious thought. Jung discovered this in his own life during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period in his late 30s when his entire worldview crumbled and had to be rebuilt from scratch. He describes feeling so exhausted during this time that simple tasks like writing a letter or having a conversation felt overwhelming. But he also noticed something interesting. The exhaustion wasn't random. It followed patterns. He was most tired after encounters with parts of himself he'd been avoiding, most drained after social situations where he had to maintain his old persona, most wiped out after days when he tried to force his new awareness back into his old lifestyle. It was like his psyche was giving him feedback about what was aligned with his emerging authentic self and what wasn't. The exhaustion was a compass, pointing him away from what was false and towards what was true. This is probably what's happening with you too. Your exhaustion isn't just random fatigue, it's information. It's your unconscious mind communicating with your conscious mind about the tremendous work that's happening beneath the surface of your awareness. Every time you choose authenticity over approval, your ego has to do extra work to override years of conditioning. Every time you see through an illusion you used to believe in, your mind has to reorganize itself around a new reality. Every time you respond consciously instead of reacting automatically, you're using psychic muscles that are still developing. It's like learning to write with your non-dominant hand. At first, it's incredibly exhausting because you have to think about every single stroke. Your hand cramps up, your brain gets tired, and you produce letters that look shaky and uncertain.
But with practice, it becomes easier, more natural, less draining. The same thing is happening with consciousness. Right now, living authentically requires enormous effort because it's still new. Every genuine response, every honest choice, every moment of real presence, it all requires conscious intention instead of happening automatically. But Jung knew that this phase is temporary. He called it the night sea journey, a period of darkness and difficulty that every hero and every mythology has to go through before emerging transformed. The exhaustion isn't a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's a sign that you're doing something incredibly difficult and important. Think about the caterpillar in the cocoon again. The process of dissolving its caterpillar body and growing butterfly wings requires enormous energy. If a caterpillar could talk during this process, it would probably say, "I'm exhausted. This transformation thing is way harder than I thought it would be." But the exhaustion isn't a problem to be fixed. It's a natural part of the process. And trying to avoid it or rush through it usually just makes it last longer. So what can you do while you're in this phase? Jung's advice was surprisingly practical. Honor the exhaustion instead of fighting it. Rest when you need to rest. Say no to things that drain your energy without giving anything meaningful back. Simplify your life as much as possible so you can devote your limited energy to the inner work that's happening. He also emphasized the importance of what he called active imagination, spending time in dialogue with the parts of yourself that are emerging. This might sound esoteric, but it's actually quite practical. It's like having regular meetings with your inner team to understand what they need and how they can work together more efficiently. Maybe that means journaling about the conflicts you're feeling between your old self and your emerging self. Maybe it means paying attention to your dreams, which Jung saw as messages from the unconscious about the work that needs to be done. Maybe it means spending time in nature or in meditation, creating space for insights to surface naturally instead of forcing them. The key insight Jung offers is this: the exhaustion you're feeling isn't a sign that you're weak or that you're doing something wrong. It's a sign that you're engaged in one of the most challenging and important tasks a human being can undertake, the conscious development of your own personality. Most people live their entire lives without ever undertaking this task. They stay in the provisional life, following scripts they inherited from their family and culture, never questioning whether those scripts actually fit who they are. It's easier, but it's also ultimately hollow. You've chosen the more difficult path. You've chosen to wake up, to become conscious, to develop into who you actually are instead of who you think you should be. And that choice requires enormous courage and energy. But here's what Jung discovered, and what you'll discover too. On the other side of this exhaustion is a kind of energy you've never experienced before. Not the borrowed energy of living according to external expectations, but the renewable energy that comes from living in alignment with your authentic self. It's like the difference between a car that runs on gasoline and a car that runs on solar power. The gasoline car can go fast and far, but it depends on constantly finding gas stations. The solar car might be slower to start, but once it's running efficiently, it can keep going as long as there's sunlight. Your old way of living was like the gasoline car. It could be very productive and impressive, but it required constant refueling from external sources, like approval, achievement, and distraction. Your new way of living is like the solar car. It's powered by something renewable and inexhaustible, but you're still learning how to operate it efficiently. Right now, you're in the installation phase. The solar panels are being mounted, the electrical systems are being connected, the new engine is being calibrated. Of course it's exhausting. You're essentially rebuilding yourself from the ground up. But Jung knew from his own experience and from working with hundreds of patients that this phase doesn't last forever. The exhaustion gradually gives way to a more sustainable kind of energy. The conscious choices that now require enormous effort will eventually become more natural. The authentic responses that feel forced right now will eventually flow more freely. And when that happens, you'll have access to reserves of energy you never knew you had. Energy that doesn't depend on caffeine or motivation or external circumstances. Energy that comes from the simple fact of being in alignment with who you actually are. There's something else Jung understood about this exhaustion that most spiritual teachers miss. It's not just about the energy you're using for inner work, it's also about the energy you're no longer getting from your old coping mechanisms. Before your awakening, you probably had all sorts of ways to boost your energy artificially. Maybe you got energy from drama and conflict. Maybe you got energy from being busy and productive. Maybe you got energy from shopping, eating, drinking, or other forms of instant gratification. Maybe you got energy from being needed by others or from achieving goals. All of these are what Jung would call borrowed energy. Energy that comes from outside sources and has to be constantly replenished. It's like being addicted to sugar for energy instead of developing the body's natural ability to maintain stable blood sugar. But as you become more conscious, these borrowed energy sources start to lose their effectiveness. Drama feels exhausting instead of exciting. Busyness feels empty instead of important. Instant gratification feels hollow instead of satisfying. Achievement feels meaningless instead of fulfilling. This is actually a good sign, but it can be terrifying. It's like your old energy sources are drying up faster than your new energy sources are coming online. You're in an energy transition period, and transition periods are always awkward and exhausting. Jung called this the withdrawal from projections. You stop projecting your life force onto external things and start to learn to generate it internally. But just like any withdrawal process, it's uncomfortable at first. Think about someone who's been drinking coffee every day for years and then decides to quit. The first few weeks are brutal. They feel exhausted, irritable, unable to focus, but eventually their natural energy systems reboot, and they discover they can function perfectly well without artificial stimulation, sometimes even better than before. The same thing is happening with your psychic energy. You're withdrawing from psychological caffeine, all the external sources of energy and meaning that were keeping you going, and learning to operate on your natural energy systems. But those natural systems need time to come online. Meanwhile, you're also dealing with what Jung called the shadow work, all those parts of yourself you've been avoiding or denying. This is like cleaning out a basement that's been used as a storage room for decades. Every box you open contains memories, emotions, or aspects of your personality that you've been spending energy to keep locked away. Some of what you find down there is beautiful. Talents you forgot you had, dreams you abandoned, parts of your personality that got buried under social expectations. But some of what you find is difficult. Anger you never expressed, grief you never processed, fears you never faced, shame you never healed. All of this material needs to be integrated, and integration takes enormous energy. It's like your psyche is running a major software update that's processing decades of backlogged files. Of course, the system is running slowly while that's happening.
But here's what Jung discovered. The more you integrate these shadow aspects, the more energy becomes available to you. Every emotion you stop suppressing, every talent you reclaim, every fear you face, it all frees up energy that was being used to maintain your psychological defenses. It's like discovering that half your computer's processing power was being used to run antivirus software. When you clean out the actual viruses and malware, you can turn off the antivirus program and suddenly everything runs much faster. Your exhaustion is partly the result of your psyche cleaning out decades of accumulated psychological malware. It's intensive work, but it's making space for your authentic self to operate much more efficiently. Jung also understood that this exhaustion often coincides with what he called the transcendent function, moments when opposing forces within your psyche start to find new ways of working together. This is like learning to use both hands equally well instead of just your dominant hand. It requires developing new neural pathways, and that development process is energy intensive. For example, maybe you're learning to integrate your need for solitude with your need for connection, or your desire for security with your desire for adventure, or your intellectual understanding with your emotional wisdom. These aren't problems to be solved, but creative tensions to be navigated consciously. Learning to hold paradox instead of choosing sides, learning to surf complexity instead of demanding simplicity, learning to dance with uncertainty instead of grasping for control. All of this requires what Jung called psychological differentiation. And differentiation is exhausting work. But it's also the work that leads to what Jung considered the ultimate goal of human development: individuation. Not becoming an individual in the sense of being separate from others, but becoming truly yourself, integrating all the different aspects of your personality into a coherent, authentic whole. Most people never attempt this work. They stay fragmented, using different personas for different situations, keeping various parts of themselves in separate compartments, living from their surface personality while their deeper self remains unknown. You've chosen to do the work of integration, of becoming whole, of developing into who you actually are rather than who you've been conditioned to be. And that work, Jung knew, is the most important work any human being can undertake. It's also the most exhausting work, especially in the beginning. You're not just changing your behavior or your beliefs, you're reorganizing the fundamental structure of your personality. You're moving from living from your ego to living from what Jung called the self, the deeper, wiser, more authentic center of your being. But here's the promise Jung offers. Once this reorganization is complete, once the integration work is done, once you're living from your authentic center, you'll have access to energy sources you never knew existed. It's the difference between a small stream and a deep well. The stream might look more active on the surface, but it's dependent on rainfall and can dry up during drought. The well is quieter, but it's connected to underground springs that never run dry. Your old personality was like the stream, lots of surface activity, but ultimately dependent on external conditions for its energy. Your emerging authentic self is like the well, less dramatic perhaps, but connected to sources of energy that are renewable and inexhaustible. Right now, you're in the drilling phase. You're going deeper than you've ever gone, and that's exhausting work. But you're also getting closer to those underground springs that will eventually provide all the energy you need to live a fully authentic life.
The exhaustion you're feeling isn't a sign that you're failing. It's a sign that you're succeeding at one of the most difficult tasks imaginable, becoming genuinely yourself in a world that rewards conformity, staying authentic in a culture that promotes masks, choosing growth over comfort at every turn. Jung believed that this kind of exhaustion is actually sacred. It's the tiredness that comes from doing work that matters, from engaging with life at the deepest possible level, from refusing to live superficially just because it's easier. So honor your exhaustion. Rest when you need to rest. Move slowly when you need to move slowly. Say no to things that don't align with your emerging authentic self. Protect your energy like the precious resource it is. And remember, every moment of tiredness you're experiencing now is an investment in a kind of aliveness you've never known before. You're not just changing your life, you're discovering who you actually are beneath all the layers of conditioning and expectation. That discovery, Jung knew, is worth all the exhaustion in the world. You're not broken, you're not regressing, you're not falling apart. You're doing the hardest work there is, the work of becoming conscious. And that work, Jung knew, is exactly what your soul came here to do. Be patient with the process. Honor the exhaustion. Trust that your psyche knows what it's doing even when you don't. And remember that every moment of fatigue you're experiencing now is an investment in a kind of aliveness you've never experienced before. The caterpillar doesn't become a butterfly by resting more or trying harder. It becomes a butterfly by surrendering completely to the process of transformation. And that's exactly what you're learning to do.